Hello friends, for today's video we're going to be doing another new fantasy releases wrap up, and I'm actually only going to have 2 fantasy books today and then 1 historical fiction, as the particular historical fiction that I wanted to talk about is one that I think that there's going to be a lot of themes and aspects to that are going to overlap with a lot of what we enjoy within fantasy. And I'll go ahead and start with that one and then get to the fantasy books, and as always I'll have timestamps in the description bar down below so you can skip ahead if you aren't really interested in the historical fiction one or you want to reference back to any of these 3. Anyway, starting with the first one, which is going to be A Crane Among Wolves. The other 2 are going to be, Spin of Fate and Sunbringer. But starting with A Crane Among Wolves, this is a essentially murder mystery investigative type of story, but it's also looking at a very corrupt person in history, as well as a lot of the individuals surrounding that person, a lot of those in power who also either emboldened them or were looking to try and overthrow them, and a lot of the evils that go along with all of that. So the setup is that you have a young girl whose sister, I should say a young woman, she's not a child, but you have a young woman whose sister has been taken by the current king, and he has her as one of his many concubines. And this particular character is trying to rescue her sister, which is a near impossible mission. If anything, it's a death sentence. And the only person really who can help her is the king's brother, who is planning a coup and who is trying to overthrow his brother. In order to try and lessen the suspicion that is placed on him, he often acquiesces to his brother. He tries to make himself look as meek and loyal as possible. And this particular aspect of his journey, you could say, is really weighing on him, but he will do whatever he has to because he recognizes just how far gone his brother is. So these 2 essentially band together to try and help one another. Our one character recognizes if she's ever going to save her sister, she probably has to take advantage of the perks that come along with knowing the prince's brother. And the prince's brother is finding himself wanting to, it almost feels as though he wants to correct the immorality that he is partaking in by having to do so much of his brother's bidding. And so he is helping our other character. And then there are also other individuals that come into the story that are not perspectives necessarily, but that I really felt gripped by. And there were a number of moments throughout the story where I was like, no, about certain things that happened. The reason I think that there's a fair amount of overlap between this and a lot of fantasy readers is, one, a lot of fantasy is so inspired by our own world, but more so historical events. And so often this is tied to political fantasy in particular. And then another aspect of this that I found to be really applicable with what a lot of us like is the way in which you really can zero in on how much the horrible things in the world permeate through every aspect of life. It doesn't matter what class you're involved in. And I do think the author did a phenomenal job of not sugarcoating things. I don't think there was shock value by any means, but there certainly were really heavy topics that were showcased throughout the story, as you could imagine just by the very premise of our main character's sister having been taken to be a concubine. And I just really felt that there are a lot of aspects to this that you're probably going to really enjoy. I mentioned, well, okay, I should clarify. You might not enjoy. That's probably not the right way to put it. But I think that you will find yourself reflecting a lot based off of a lot of the events that transpire within this. I mentioned in a dedicated Age of Madness non-spoiler review that I did that if you really like that theme in Age of Madness of looking at the ways in which it doesn't really matter who's holding power, power in and of itself tends to corrupt, and power has a way of always maintaining the wealth within a certain group of people, and no matter how much people insist that they will make things different, that they're going to bring progress to the world, that they're going to help those in need, really all you do at the end of the day is switch hands. You don't really actually have any change come about, as awful as that sounds and as bleak as that sounds. But if you like those kinds of themes explored in your fantasy works, and that's one of the things I was talking specifically about with Age of Madness that I think it does so well, if you like stories that show that, I think that there's a good chance that A Crane Among Wolves will be really appealing to you. Now, that said, oh shoot, gosh darn it, one of my tabs I had my finger on the page for a Spin of Fate that I wanted to highlight, and apparently I just took it off, so hopefully I can find whatever it was that I was going to talk to you about. But anywho, getting back to A Crate Among Wolves, the historical fiction aspects. I have read Red Palace by this author, and I really enjoyed that one. And one of the elements that I enjoyed so much was, first off, I don't know much at all about the particular time and place that our author chooses to focus on. And there is always a murder mystery element tied in the previous one, Red Palace. I think that the murder mystery felt a little bit more the driving force in the story, whereas in this one, it was more so another additional ingredient in what was otherwise this coup. And I kind of liked that there was this additional thing tied in, because it was easy to get caught up in wanting the king to be taken out, but then being like, but wait a second, who's the person? And I will say, there was a few times where I was thinking, I think it's this person. Oh, maybe it's this person. And then I eventually settled on a person, and then the more that I was confident in that, the more I feel like I was like, okay, yeah, I'm pretty sure it's this person. I think it's this person. And I really liked having those questions. I really liked wondering, and I think the author did a really good job of not necessarily making it incredibly obvious, but also having there be things and hints along the way and clues where you could figure it out. I always appreciate when authors strike that really good balance, and I think that she did in A Crate Among Wolves. In general, I just thought that this was done exceptionally. I really enjoyed it. I also want to say, I think she did a fantastic job of writing what is basically an unlikable character. The character who is looking to rescue her sister, which might make her seem like she's this heroic person. No, when you are introduced to her, she was previously very pampered and privileged and relatively spoiled, and you still see traces of that in her. And in some ways, it is that stubbornness that is sort of pushing her on and motivating her, so in a way it becomes her strength. But it does make her relatively unlikable for a long time. And she's pretty, I almost want to say she's selfish, because there are times where she's like, I just want to save my sister. I couldn't care less what happens to everybody else. And you're like, that's pretty harsh. But at the same time, I'm like, well, you know, I kind of like having a character that is rough around the edges, that is a little bit more cutthroat, and in a realistic way. And she kind of blames herself too for a lot of what's happened. So I really appreciate that the author didn't try to write her as this perfect human. I do think she becomes more likable as the story progresses, but she starts out in a place where she is understandably really unlikable at first. Now getting into the fantasy stories, we'll start with A Spin of Fate, because I don't want to accidentally rip out any more of my tabs. So this is a story that honestly really took me by surprise with just how intense the world building is, specifically with the magic. There is a lot going on with the magic, which is honestly the majority of my tabs, because I have a lot of tabs. There's going to be a lot that when the sequel comes around eventually, which I plan to read, I'm going to want to be able to reference back to explanations of the magic and the world and kind of sort of the religion of everything, because there's a lot of information, and I was really excited about that. This is YA fantasy. I could see this being a YA fantasy a lot of adult fantasy readers really enjoy, because of the fact that it has that more in-depth world building. I think that's something a lot of people like about adult fantasy. In fact, I would say sometimes, of course, people are really drawn to the exceptionally mature themes and the content that maybe you wouldn't find in young adult, or particular aspects to what the characters are going through that are more so like what we go through in later stages of life. Of course, there's all of those things, but there are some fantasy readers who gravitate towards adult fantasy purely because they like the more intense world building that you sometimes don't get as often in YA. And you can, of course, have it in both, but I do find that it tends to be more often occurring in adult fantasy. But if you do like that about adult fantasy, then I would say automatically, before I even talk about the rest of the story, that this one might be one to keep your eyes out for, or keep your eyes peeled to consider. It's one that you might want to consider. The main perspective, although you do get multiple perspectives, is initially a young girl named Aina. And within their world, there are different realms that are associated with how much your soul is pure. So the purer the soul, the more you will ascend. The lowest area is where Aina was born, which is incredibly unfair, as how can your soul already be tainted when you are a newborn and you've not done anything at all to possibly make yourself a bad person? So Aina kind of sees the realities of what seems to be flaws within the religious beliefs of a lot of their society, but through some kind of inciting incident that she doesn't understand and you as the reader don't really understand, she ends up ascending in a way that doesn't seem possible. And so now she is in one of the higher realms, but her mother is still in the lower realm. So Aina is determined actually to get back to the lower realm so that she can be with her mother again. In her efforts, she ends up coming across this very pampered young man who all he cares about is following the codes of, I'm going to refer to it as their religion, the tyrannic law. He is named Ernell, and he is very set on being this perfect person, and part of his motivations are due to the fact that his brother and everyone in his family are so perfect. A lot of them have already ascended to an even higher realm, and that's all he wants to do. And he is essentially offended by Aina and the fact that she's willing to throw away her existence within the middle realm to return to the lower realm. He just doesn't understand how she could possibly do that. Why would you taint your soul in that way? Why would you go against this gift you've been given? So he doesn't understand at all. And then you have an additional individual named Mazan. He is somebody who has a clan that he cares very much about, and he is within the lowest realm. And these three end up joining forces, and they join a rebel group who is actually from one of the higher realms, and they are determined to do what they can to deliver aid to those in the lower realm. So if it's not already clear, there's a lot of questions about, and I really loved this theme about the story, the idea of you are deserving of your place in society. And this is a relatively heavy theme, I think, because there is sort of a mindset sometimes that, well, if you're doing well in life, it's because you've earned it and you worked hard for it. And sometimes people can tie that to your work ethic. Sometimes people can tie that to your beliefs and how good of a person you are, and this idea that you'll receive so much in life if only you are good. And there are certain people that will believe that wholeheartedly, and thus they'll look at somebody who has less and they'll think, well, they deserve to be there because they're not as good of a person, or they didn't work as hard. And so this book is kind of tackling those very themes, and it's tackling it through the eyes of characters, some of which that believe those things, some of which are like, no, there's absolutely no way. How can you condemn a child to that fate and think that they deserve to have less and to be in more danger? So I really appreciated those heavier themes. I think they're navigated really, really well. I think the ways in which the characters are exposed to different things is done seamlessly within the story. And one of the tabs has to do with a quote from somebody that says, as the preservations say, there is a reason the universe imposes such trials upon the lower realms. Those people are there because they sinned. Suffering is the quickest way to burn their sins and reverse the spin of their souls. Curbing it would go against tyrannic law, against the natural order of things. So this particular rebel group, they don't agree with this mindset, this idea that if you somehow try to help those in need, that you're going against the natural order of things. They don't believe in that. They think it is their job as people who are in a more privileged position to help those in need, but this is almost seen as an affront to nature itself. So I really enjoyed all of the morality that was questioned. But then the magic. I mentioned that the magic is where I think a lot of the intense world building takes place, and there's so much to it, but there are aspects to the magic that have to do with your ability to kind of manipulate the environment and how you can kind of attach yourself to it and become one with it in a sense. It's kind of hard to explain, but then you can also sort of transport your mind outside your body, so you're in this spirit form in a way. And there have been some comparisons, and it says even on the back, to Avatar: The Last Airbender, and I can understand with some of the more spirit-like forms they go into why there would be those comparisons, and then also just having your way of life challenged and having to reflect on what you've always been told and if that's really the right way. I think there are certainly aspects of Avatar: The Last Airbender where I can see those comparisons, but I don't think it's a one-to-one. It's not exactly the same. So I actually could see a lot of people trying to compare this to other stories, and then while there might be some comparisons that are somewhat true of specifics in this, I don't think there's any one single story where you're like, oh, if you like this, for sure, this will work. Because it's so unique. I really haven't read anything like this ever, I don't think. So I remember in the marketing seeing all these different comp titles. Like one of them was Full Metal Alchemist, which I don't really agree with that. And then I saw An Ember in the Ashes, which I was like, okay, maybe sort of like the rebel group aspect to it and the questioning of those in power, maybe that a little bit. And then Avatar: The Last Airbender, I just explained why I can see some of that. But I just kept seeing all of these comparisons, and I really don't think any one comparison does this justice. I think there's just so much to this that was really interesting, really well thought out, a really fascinating world that the author has created. So I really, really like what she did with this. I am going to have to go back through and reference all my tabs to refresh myself because there's just so much to this. It was really cool. I quite enjoyed it. And then last for today, we have Sunbringer, finally. So much of what transpires in this is difficult to state without spoiling the first one. So I am going to give some information about the first one, and then I'll be vague about this second one. So the first one, God Killer, we follow an individual who is a Vega, or a God Killer. And the way that gods work in this world is they gain their power through the worship of humans and through shrines that humans create, the gifts that humans bestow upon these shrines. That is how they gain more and more power. And some of the gods are incredibly powerful, and then other ones are just little tiny things that have hardly any power at all. But they do, as a result of gaining power from humans, sometimes wreak havoc on mankind. Some of them can really cause a lot of harm, especially when they have connections to the environment, like fire or the ocean itself. Our humans, there are some of them that want to continue to worship gods. However, there was a war where somebody, in an effort to rid humans from the effects of gods, they tried to eliminate pretty much every god out there and destroy all of the shrines. They haven't completely eradicated the gods, which is where God Killers come into the picture, and where our main character, Kissin, specifically comes into the picture. Kissin is somebody who is rough around the edges. She has seen firsthand what kinds of atrocities can occur because of the gods, and she has a little bit of a chip on her shoulder. She doesn't mind doing what she does. However, because there are some human beings that wish they could still worship gods, she's also not the most liked, even if she has the crown backing her profession. Her story ends up intertwining with a young girl who, unknown to anybody why this has occurred, she has a god that is essentially connected to her. Not that they share the same body, but that they cannot separate from one another for too much of a distance, and if they try to, they will be in immense pain. This particular god that has bonded to this girl, they also don't understand why this has happened, but they are the god of white lies, and they kind of can manipulate people by encouraging certain thoughts within them. And I really liked the way that the big powers and the little powers are explored in it. Kissin immediately wants to just try to kill the god when the little girl's like, help me, help us. But she has a connection to this god, and they care about each other. And also it's kind of like an animal companion, and it's really cute. And also sometimes it's kind of sinister because it does want people to worship it sometimes, because it just like it gets power that way. So you see this, you're kind of conflicted with when you do get into the god's head. And Kissin starts to find herself really becoming protective of this girl. She decides to help her in a quest to try and figure out how to separate this girl and this god. And then you have one other character that enters the picture, who is somebody that was a knight for the king that sort of rid the world of the major influences of the gods. And so these three band together and they go on this quest. And I've said before, there are a lot of aspects to the story that remind me of Witcher, that kind of found family, Geralt and Ciri vibe, especially even in how Kissen is treated by society and her profession. It reminds me of Geralt and him being a monster hunter. So I loved the first book. It left off in a very intense place. And the second book was one of my most anticipated releases of the year, and it did not disappoint. Again, I can't really say too much. I'm trying to figure out what I can say because there's a lot of things that I want to say, but I also don't want to reveal anything about the first one. But I was rooting for everybody to just be happy, which is the most generic thing I could possibly say. But the whole book, I was kind of like, I just need everybody to have a happily ever after. I just need everybody to be one big happy family because I love the found family of this, and I just want everybody to be together. I don't want anybody to be hurt. I want everybody to just be able to like go off and live happily ever after, you know. So anyway, I found that the whole book were pretty on edge. There are a lot of people who really, the idea of, some people want gods to return. Some people are like, hey, gods aren't all bad. I think that really took the focus and the stage in this second book. But simultaneously, you have people who really want to hold on to power and have kind of gone against the very principles that they supposedly held to and tried to hold society to. Within book one, they kind of go against that and use that to gain more power, and it was great. And also, I'm just always intrigued by how the gods' powers manifest. It was great. It was so cool. There is an element kind of almost like a secret library too, which I kind of miss. I feel like I don't see that as often in fantasy these days. But there's also kind of an emphasis on knowledge and the significance and importance of not trying to rid the world of knowledge. And I gotta say, this author has a way of writing really edge-of-your-seat scenes. There's a particular moment where one of our characters, I don't want to say who, but one of our characters is off on their own, and they are witnessing what some individuals are willing to do to try to bring back, you know, a certain god. And this character has seen it all before, so when they're seeing it again, they're baffled, and they, on their own, despite being injured and hungry and tired, are doing everything they can to go against what these other people are doing. And it's just the way the scene is written is it's kind of creepy and horrific, and I was like, gosh, so she can really suck you into a scene. So I cannot wait for the third and final book. I don't know how everything's gonna wrap up. I do think that there are certain questions that I still kind of want the answers to. We did get some answers that I was like, oh, okay, how's that work though? And why haven't other people known this before? So I like that we got some things answered, but then there are other threats that are coming into the picture that I'm like, okay, but wait, what? Who's this? What's this? You know, it's kind of one of those moments. I'm so sorry that I have to be so vague, but it was really good, and I'm really excited for the third one. I don't know if I enjoyed it as much as the first one, just because I think the first one really had that developing of the found family, and as a result of just that alone, I think maybe the first one might have taken the cake for me, but both are great. I think this book does kind of have that, not middle book syndrome in a bad way, but it feels like a middle book, you know. It's kind of bringing us out of the heavy events at the end of the first one. It's getting everything started with this, you know, we have to move another thing forward, and then we got to lead into what is obviously the conclusion. And I think it did all that well. It just felt like that's where we were in the journey. It just feels like we're in the middle of it all. So it was good, and I need the third one. But anyway, if you do want to say something about Sunbringer, and if you want to say anything about any of these books that is spoilery, just make sure you write spoilers in your comment and then enter so that nobody is spoiled for any of these things. And if you're interested in reading any of these, or if you have thoughts on any of these, feel free, of course, to leave those. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. If you are interested in checking any of these out, I'll have purchase links in the description bar down below. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later.